Good afternoon, one and all, and welcome to our final Americanist dinner forum for the fall 2021 semester. I'm Joe Bartzel, and tonight's topic, or this evening's topic, is the controversy in our nation over what's being called critical race theory and its place in K12 education. And tonight, we're going to be taking a close look at the local connections of this national controversy. The St. Louis region has obviously been, for many decades now, a site of racial struggle, particularly focused around issues of K-12 education, with the history in the region of desegregation and busing and the various controversies that it's raised over the decades, with the controversies over the place of charter schools as a part of the broader picture of education and what it means to provide a quality education on an equitable basis to the young people of St. Louis. And we've seen over the decades in St. Louis various controversies over districting, over accreditation of districts. And so as we think about the critical race theory controversy as it continues to embroil the nation, it's helpful for us to think about what the local connections are and how this controversy that seems to be nationwide also implicates various aspects of the history of the St. Louis region in particular. We're pleased this evening to have three illustrious panelists. First, we have Anastasia Allen, who is the Executive Director of Navigate STL Schools, which is a St. Louis City-focused nonprofit organization that helps families learn about the local school system and the school options that are available to them. Originally from Toledo, Ohio, and a graduate of The Ohio State University. I apologize, Anastasia, for the outcome of Saturday's game. Anastasia has spent her career working in nonprofit and education-based organizations and returns to the St. Louis area extremely passionate about helping to provide equitable access to education for all families. Next, we have Curtis O'Dwyer. Curtis is a passionate educator in the University City School District who is committed to doing what's best for kids and to being a champion for educational equity and justice. This is his 6th year teaching middle school science since graduating with his Master of Arts in Teaching from Washington University in the spring of 2016. He's also the founder of STEAM Master, a program that remixes science education by integrating hip-hop practice, pedagogy, and critical lens into science curriculum to encourage student mastery and support student science identity development. Currently, Curtis serves as a science teacher in the University City School District and a board member for Educators for Social Justice. And finally, we have Ebony M. Duncan Shippey, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Education at Washington University in St. Louis. She examines the impact of race and racism on education reform policy, school community relationships, and the schooling experiences of marginalized youth in the United States. Her current work examines the implications of charter schools and school choice for racial disparities in education and the social correlates and determinants of school closures in predominantly African-American communities. Her newest book, Shuttered Schools, Race, Community, and School Closures in American Cities, published by Information Age Publishing in 2019, analyzes the disproportionate impact of public school closures on African-American students in cities across the United States. And so we're going to begin with each of our panelists taking a few minutes to offer some introductory comments, after which we'll start to get into questions from the audience. So let's begin with Anastasia, who will be talking with us this afternoon about the history of education in St. Louis, why St. Louisans see K-12 education as such an important site of anxiety and struggle in matters of racial equity and justice, and why so many parents in the St. Louis region see this critical race theory controversy as having such high stakes for their own children. And with that, I will hand it off to Anastasia.
Hi, everybody. My name is Anastasia. And I, like our moderator said, I'm the executive director of a nonprofit called Navigate STL Schools. One of the questions that we get a lot is, why does an organization like Navigate STL Schools need to exist in 2021? And the short and the long answer to that is racism. And what it means to build institutions in a way to keep individuals out. So I think it's really important to understand the history of public education in the city of St. Louis to really help everyone kind of wrap their head around it. And when I say city of St. Louis, also think a little bit regionally, because it has had kind of a blossoming effect into the region. The first technical public school format in the city of St. Louis started in 1815 with this like each one teach one philosophy. So think schoolhouses and Little House on the Prairie and that way of educating individuals. From there, you have your first elementary school started in 1838. But the first elementary school that African Americans could attend didn't open until 1845. And after that, a law was passed that said that it was illegal for individuals to actually educate African Americans in the whole state of Missouri. So from there, Reverend John Barry Meacham started a freedom school where he actually bought a barge and took a bunch of students of color, Black students, onto the Mississippi River for 8 hours a day, where he would then educate them on the boat, since it was illegal for anybody to educate them on land. That was highly contentious in the area, and a lot of people fought against it, but technically he was in the middle of the Mississippi River, so it wasn't much that anyone can do about it. From there, you see a lot happen in what you want to call a short period of time, but not really. So you see a school for the blind open, you see a school for the deaf open, and you start seeing people want to educate different types of people while simultaneously stating that they cannot educate African Americans. The first public high school and the first public school for African Americans wasn't actually opened in St. Louis until 1875, with Sumner High School being the first school of its kind to educate African Americans at a high school level west of the Mississippi. And Sumner is still a school that's around today, but it's also one of the schools that over the past 15 years has been slated for closure several times due to lack of attendance, which also has a lot to do with race and strategic divestment in that area. From there, you get this long history of just people strategically leaving people of color out of the ways in which they're educating people in the city. In 1890, you start to see Harris Stowe Teacher College come out, where people are saying, okay, well, if you don't want to educate us, then we'll come up with our own teachers to educate our students. Then you have Plessy versus Ferguson, which we know created the separate but equal standard. And that means that people can now create schools, more schools for African Americans to attend in the city or on land in Missouri without kind of facing that backlash, because you have to do it, but you don't have to have them with your students in the same schoolhouses. You see a school for students of color with disabilities open in 1925. And then in 1944, that's when SLU actually integrates. So in this entire time, there isn't anywhere in the region for people of color to receive higher education other than Harris Stowe Teachers College. They have to start leaving the state to go and get higher education. You see the Catholic diocese actually integrate in 1948. And then you start to see a little bit more fast-paced things happening. Harris Stowe actually gets accredited as a university in the 1970s, 1960s area. But then right after that, you start seeing that mini Lindo lawsuit, which leads to the VIC program. And that is when 13,000 students of color, Black students, particularly in St. Louis City, said that we are not being properly educated. We want to take our talents to South Beach. And so all of these students are moving into the county, which becomes important because you have to understand why counties were settled. So a lot of people in the city wanted their kids to get proper education. They wanted their tax dollars to fund the education for their kids, but they didn't necessarily want their kids in schools with Black people. So they established these municipalities, many of which still have laws on the books today that says that you can't sell your homes to African-American people. And so they created their own counties or districts to create their own independent school systems. And then you have students getting bused in. And I think we've seen even in recent history as early as, or as late as 2015, when Normandy School District lost their accreditation and their students were sent other places, where families are very protective in this space about having others come into their community to be educated along with their children. And so you can only imagine what that did at the start of the VIC program. And now, almost 30 years later, you're starting to see them strategically close that program out because of some of these same things that were issues in the beginning still happening today. And then when you get into more public schools, you start to see the VIC program coming into play. You see a lot of families thinking that they have to actually leave St. Louis City in order to get a proper education. You see SLPS lose its accreditation, and then you see an influx of charter schools into the region because you have to have a quality public option for people in the region to receive schooling. And so now you get this mix in St. Louis City where you have charter schools and you have public schools. But what it all really boils down to is people were very strategic in the region about how do I make sure that my kids get the best education? And for a lot of people in the time that the counties were being established, that meant that not being educated with Black people. And they created these townships and shelters for their tax dollars to create better school districts for their children. So now you get into 2021 where you have families who are wondering, why are there over 157 different school options in the city of St. Louis, not even counting the surrounding areas where I can send my children? Why do they all have different deadlines and different application processes and different requirements for entry? Why is it that if I live one block this way or one block that way, my kid is eligible for free pre-K or not eligible for free pre-K? And where did all of this come from? And what it came from is a method of gatekeeping. You have different systems that are started in different ways so that individuals can make sure that the right type of students are applying to their programs. It's no accident that through the VIC program at its height, they were sending 13,000 students to different areas to receive public schooling. It wasn't I don't want to be schooled in public schools, is I don't want to be schooled in St. Louis public schools. So now SLPS sends almost 5,000 kids through the VIC program to the county, but they're getting only 94 students in approximately. And all of those students are attending the magnet high schools and magnet school programs. So we're sending a lot of people out and we're not getting a lot of people coming back in, and the people that are coming back in are only going into the magnet programs. It's also no accident that the city of St. Louis is almost 50-50 between Black and white. However, when you get into the magnet schools, you do see a almost 70% white versus 30% Black population in those school settings. And all of this goes to say that these programs were created to keep white people in the city, and they were created to create more elite options for those parents who did not necessarily, and I don't want to make it seem like everybody's racist because it's not, it's almost not intentional at that point, where people have been conditioned to believe that a quality education can only come in these circumstances and not be able to be conceived in other circumstances. And so as Navigate STL Schools, our mission is to increase equity, which means that a lot of people don't know that the magnet school applications for SLPS actually opened up on October 1st, when most families, particularly families of colors, are actually just getting settled into their current school system, into their current school buildings, and aren't really thinking about next year. But a lot of other parents, a lot of white parents are. It's not a secret, or it's a well-kept secret that applicant pool A actually closed the day before Thanksgiving, and then pool B closes at the start of January, where a lot of families are not necessarily thinking about the next school year. So then you already have a lot of parents of color and low income parents that are closed out of these highly selective or highly performing seats. A lot of families don't understand the process of being tested for gifted and talented. They don't understand the requirements that go into it. And there are families that create these mommy networks and things like that, where this information is widely known in their communities. And so our goal is to make sure that every single family in the city of St. Louis, regardless of income, regardless of color, has access to every piece of information to be able to actually enroll in a school that's going to be a good fit for them. And how critical race theory plays a role in that is because without understanding that context, it's easy to believe that all of this was an accident, that somebody made a decision here and somebody made a decision there, and now whoops, look at us, it's a little bit more complicated than it needs to be. But until you understand the history, it's going to be deeply impossible to undo the divides that have been created in our education system when it comes to actually being able to access education before students can even get into a classroom to receive a quality product from teachers that's going to teach them a true history.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Anastasia. Our next speaker will be Curtis O'Dwyer, and Curtis is going to talk to us about the intersection between historically Black educational philosophies and the rise of the critical race theory debate here in St. Louis. So Curtis, please take it away.
Hey, Joe, yes, thank you for that. So honestly, yeah, I just want to go ahead and jump right into it like a traditional Baptist pastor and give you my 3 points and then be right out of the way. But I believe that it's important that we look at this intersection between historically Black teaching philosophy and the contemporary critical race theory debate. And my first point is this, is that I think it's about time. I think it's about time that we've begun to have these conversations, because I think there's something that's been brewing for quite a while. And when I say that it's about time, I don't mean that in reference to necessarily the critical race theory itself. While that's important, it's something that needs to be understood. But I'm talking in more of a broad sense of the conversation that I think really undergirds much of the confusion around critical race theory. And that's about how will schools seek to help students understand and discuss race and racism in classrooms, and particularly with students. And I think that's an important piece to be considered, and oftentimes isn't in the way that it should, because it's a scar in American history. And so we set and or try to ignore it and act as if it hasn't happened or isn't happening currently, when in actuality it is. And also the other point with this is that it's painful. It's painful for everyone for different reasons, obviously, but this is a pain that we must address, right? Because just similar with our bodies, when we have pain that shows up, and this is me thinking also as a science teacher, that's an indicator that there's something off. And we must need to address it, because if we don't, it could have detrimental effects. And so the opposite, though, is also true, because when we do address it, when we do acknowledge it and try to speak to it, then that's where we can lead to the true life, healing, and restoration possibilities that could flow. But pretty much what I would believe is this, is that as long as there continues to be pain from racism in our society, then we must continue to critically examine ways that we can bring about the healing in the work. And so what I believe too, though, is that when we are trying to think about how do we have conversations about race and racism in the classrooms, and how do we think about how we bring about this healing across our schools and across St. Louis, I would beg that we lean upon historically Black teaching philosophy. And I say that because historically Black teaching philosophy has always had a critical examination of race, largely to a couple of reasons. One, certainly due to the need for survival, right? Like you had to have a deep understanding of race because if not, then it could lead to confusion as to what possible outcomes that could implicate upon sort of your life and well-being. But then there's also the need for understanding race as we think about how to uplift and develop and liberate a people. And so that's more so thinking about sort of this thriving component. And so when we look at historically Black teaching philosophy, I think of the work by Teresa Perry in the book Young, Gifted, and Black. And in there, she quotes a creed that kind of has taken form by Robert Septo that says, literacy for freedom and freedom for literacy. And really that their statement is really an anchor to historically Black teaching philosophy, because it speaks to our vigorous commitment towards seeking education and wanting that. But then also it's deeply connected to this here racial uplift and trying to assert ourselves as a people group in the larger society. Why this I feel is very important, even as we're shifting now to thinking about the current times, is because, well, once we had schools eventually integrate, think of Brown versus Board of Education. This here decision led to the integration of schools. However, one of the things that was a detriment to this here integration was that while it integrated Black bodies, it did not integrate Black teachers, which leads to the shortage that we see in educated in schools today. It did not integrate Black thinkers, so the wisdom, the philosophy, the scholarship did not follow. It did not integrate Black testimonies or the experiences that students could use in order to leverage and connect with the learning. And it did not integrate Black truths, be it Black history. And so how then are we going to begin to grow out of this and deal with the void, the gap that sort of has followed due to this here desegregation efforts, and try to redeem that work, right? In a way of which can lead to the success for all is, I believe we have to begin thinking about how then can we apply this here philosophy to the current times, and to bring it to our moment at where we're at right now. I believe that historically Black teaching philosophy is something that has really began to take on more attention and more traction, especially in 2020, when we saw a lot of social uprising across our nation, educational equity, the need for DEI coordinators became a hot commodity, and people were really wanting it. And so they began to even lean upon a lot of scholars who are leading in this work, like Goldie Muhammad, or excuse me, but I like Goldie Muhammad, or like Dr. Bettina Love. Oh, let me wait till this announcement. I'm sorry. I'm at the school. All right, kids dismissing. But we began to lean on a lot of this scholarship and work that once we have these here templates, it really kind of gives us a way of how can we effectively have these conversations in classroom spaces that speak to the identity of kids, that speak to the skill sets and knowledge which education traditionally focus on, but then also can bring in that criticality that can help leverage education for all the students and bring about this sort of unity, I guess, in diversity that our traditional academic setting was designed to do. And so I'm really saying this as, when we think about critical race theory and the contemporary critical race, the debate, all of this is a sort of connection to the historical roots that we have when it pertains to Black educational philosophy. And what we should be thinking about is how can we utilize that to bring it into the classrooms to support the work that teachers are doing to help students. Because at the end of the day, that's really what all of this is about. But this here sort of philosophy hasn't been used due to power and privilege that has sort of silenced that work.
All right, thank you, Curtis. And our third speaker will be Dr. Ebony Duncan Shippey from Washington University's Department of Education, who is going to talk about the relationship between the debate over critical race theory and the purposes of education, in particular, taking a look at education as a site of racial struggle, and then thinking about the social significance of the critical race theory debate beyond education. Please take it away, Evan.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Joe. And I really appreciate the setup from Anastasia and Curtis in terms of thinking about the history of how education has developed in our region and the implications of our school desegregation efforts for our experiences in the classroom today. I really appreciated the question that you posed to us, Joe, around what is it about K-12 education that makes it, I think you said, a recurring site of racial struggle. And the irony is since we're talking about critical race theory, a critical race theorist might ask you, well, why wouldn't it be? Why would we expect it not to be a site of racial struggle if racial struggle characterizes the ways in which every other institution operates in this country? So when I'm thinking about the purposes of education, while we take it for granted, many of us know that education is not just what happens in the classroom. It's not just teaching and learning. That is the essence of it, and that is the heart of it. But in terms of the social purposes that it serves, we all have an investment in what education can do to sustain society. And I don't want to sound like I'm being dramatic or overstating this, but I think that the reason why we're seeing such a contentious response here in Rockwood and elsewhere to efforts to make education more inclusive is because it feels like a direct attack on the character of the institution of education today for many folks. And so what do I mean by that? Well, when we're thinking about kind of education and how it operates, how it benefits us on a societal level, education incorporates newcomers. Education creates opportunities for us to gain status, or I should say it, I guess, impute status to us, opportunities to make it, if we're thinking about this in an individual socioeconomic mobility sense. But it also socializes us in terms of transmitting values, transmitting norms. As a social institution, it helps manage and organize daily life. And for some of us, that means that our identities are more deeply rooted in some institutions than others. And I think that's part of what is motivating some of the animus that we see. Much of this, though, I think is backlash against Black Lives Matter protests. So, you know, some of what we're seeing today, we already saw an earlier wave of this. So in 2016, schools around the country, teachers around the country organized to stage Black Lives Matter at school, Black Lives Matter action weeks at schools. And so we saw an initial wave of backlash to efforts then. And then, of course, as we've already discussed, following the summer of 2020 demonstrations, particularly around George Floyd in Minneapolis and elsewhere, we saw districts coming out announcing new DEI plans, as Curtis has already touched upon, looking for new diversity, equity, and inclusion coordinators. And there were these efforts, which I agree with Curtis. I actually think that these are long overdue, but kind of finally responding to the efforts of organizers of communities of color in particular to making our education more public. Okay. So we have kind of where we are today, the critical race theory response, and we can use that in quotes because we won't even get into the tenets of critical race theory because how it's being misrepresented is a bit frustrating. Well, we can talk about that in the Q&A if anybody wants to. But in thinking about what critical race theory is, or what the main contention is is that when people hear DEI or they hear race or they hear critical race theory, this is you're teaching students that white people are racist and that people of color are victims. Okay, and that's fundamentally what the messaging is. Now, why that is a misrepresentation of what, not only what many districts are attempting to do, but why it's also a misrepresentation of even that interpretation is because what critical race theory says is that racism is not an aberration, that it's normal and that it's a central part to the development of this country. Those are kind of like the fundamental, I said I wasn't gonna talk about it, but here, I told you, Joe. But here we are. So that is what critical race theory says. So to say that, it's not saying that all white people here today are racist and that they're responsible for the atrocities that we have seen in past and present, but it's saying that we have a collective responsibility. We all, including white people, have a collective responsibility to redress the effects that racism continues to have on our institutions today, including education. It's just ironic that something as, from my perspective, as minor as including greater representation in your textbooks or in the books in the library of the students that you're supposed to be serving in the school. So the district is attempting to make their school more public, make Rockwood, the Rockwood School District and the materials available there a better representation of the students that it serves. But to push back on that suggests that preserving the status quo, preserving what is, and the interests that are driving, or I should say the interests underlying that push, really suggests that we really want education to be private. And I think, Anastasia, you touched upon this in talking about how many of the suburban localities developed. And I think part of that is not just driven by this localism that was underlying and preserving, or I should say relocating segregation or redrawing the boundaries. So it wasn't just about that piece of it. I also think that what we're seeing here is we already talked about the BLM. I think that part of what we're seeing in Rockwood in particular and how it's been politicized in Rockwood in particular is a spinoff of some of the issues around COVID, school closure, et cetera. And there's a particular Facebook group. I was a member, but I was discovered and removed from this Facebook group earlier in 2020. I had a teacher add me so that I could observe. But the short of it is, there was a politicization around COVID, masking, and school closure. And this group formed under the consistent with ideologies driving that politicization. And so that was really what you were seeing from this group. And that's what we were seeing elsewhere in the country. In many of these spaces, what is now happened is that it's become a way for particularly far right-leaning politicians to invigorate their base and send out misinformation through these sites, including talking points around critical race theory. Like if you look at the talking points from parents in Loudoun County, here in Loudoun County in Virginia, we can come back to that in Q&A because that's a whole nother, you think it's crazy here. In a few other localities around the country, and we look at some of what the parents were saying here, it's almost verbatim. And so it's really interesting how this has unfolded here. But to take it to the, I guess my greatest concern, and I keep coming back to this point around, do we really want public education to be public? My greatest concern is that we don't. My greatest concern is that we are going to say, and this is what we're seeing in polls right now. Okay, 60% of parents are in support. Literally 60% of parents are in support of having schools teach some version of what we're calling critical race theory. Okay, and 30% of parents, or excuse me, 40% of parents are not, 10% of parents are somewhere in the middle or neutral. But what we see is same, somewhere in the middle, or they did not answer. But what we see is a sharp racial divide, as you would expect. So in this particular poll, they only talked to white and Black parents, but 80% of Black parents were in support of teaching critical race theory types of information, while it was 37% of white parents. Okay. Now, we don't know what the breakdown is in Rockwood. There are at least 2 parent groups. So there were parents, I forget, it was like the Midwest Equity something. So parents who came out in support of the district's plan. And then we also saw the parents, obviously those who had the most news coverage and the more egregious behavior, who were anti. The last thing I wanted to say. But why, why I'm concerned and why I think this is not something that we can expect to go away, especially not before the end of the 2022 election cycle, is that we're seeing enough spikes in violence and threats against school district officials, and we're seeing enough resignations that we've seen the advisory memo issued from Merrick Garland encouraging local police precincts and school districts to coordinate to protect and provide additional security to school board members. And the FBI has set up a hotline to report attacks and threats. And it comes down to, if we're thinking about education as perspective, like future thinking, what type of future do we want to have? I guess that's what it comes down to me. What type of future do we want to have? And I'll end my comments there. I think I've talked too long.
Well, I'm actually gonna follow up with you on that, but not just yet, because I'd like to circle around to that question of what kind of future do we want to have, because that, I think, is one of the big questions that really is animating a lot of the controversy around critical race theory. But first, I'd like to go back to Curtis, actually. Curtis, you talked about the ways that attempts to integrate Black students into various previously predominantly white school districts has integrated Black students or integrated Black bodies, but not Black teachers or thinkers or experiences or testimony. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit then about the pipeline for Black teachers and the pipeline for getting Black perspectives and Black experiences into the classroom. You as an active teacher in a middle school here in the St. Louis region, what's your impression of the pipeline for Black teachers, and whether the pipeline, and here I'm talking about education departments at universities and the processes of accreditation, how are those sort of pipeline issues affecting the extent to which Black perspectives and Black teachers are actually making it into classrooms?
Yeah, good question. When you ask this, I'm initially thinking about, how are we gonna take, even think about the present generation of students right now who are in our classes growing up and saying, how are they gonna then go on and wanna be teachers? And I think about a lot of the harm that gets done to Black students in the classrooms that, really we're having a conversation of why would they want to return to this space in which they've experienced this harm, this trauma. And so part of that is us continuing, and that's where it's important that we have this sort of lens, because this lens isn't just about us talking about necessarily the history only, but how do we heal and grow through it, right? But also I believe that so if we're trying to bring students in, we're going to have to deal with that their discomfort, that their space that why would I return again to this here place of trauma? But I do think that one of the pieces that connects this that will make a student want to is when they have a teacher in their educational experience that they felt really spoke to who they are. And that, again, when we're talking about, like Ebony had mentioned, having these curriculums that would make their school setting more diverse, more inclusive, more representative of their student body, but not only just that it has to be representative of the student body, but representative of our world. And so that when students are going out into society, they can interact in ways that are respectable, in ways that are, there's this level of consciousness, this level of awareness. But a lot of the students are going to be, it's going to be dependent upon, did they have a teacher that helped to redefine some of these here injustices that they're seeing in the ways that it's happening. So talk about that pipeline of closing it. It starts first in the classroom, but then beyond that, there are efforts in which schools are supporting and incentivizing more Black teachers. And so whether that be programs that are going to sort of work with kids in the high school setting and then bring them through this kind of this mentorship relationship, that's one way. Then the other way, though, is I believe developing sort of these coalitions, these spaces in which Black educators who are coming into the field can feel supported. And so it's not always the question of how do we gain more, but also how do we retain? And so like right now, we have a lot of educators leaving the field. And it's partly due to what we're seeing around critical race theory is but then it's also partly due to the demands. And so you have all these stressors kind of building up. It's important that you have a space in which you feel supported. So for example, I would think about my own experience in the Kirkwood School District. There's a space in which we have Kirkwood teachers of color. It's important to have these here spaces, and because of the experiences in which you have navigating more diverse settings. But then also, it's the way in which we think about retention is going to be done through other intentional efforts. And so there has to be more policy and changes that are going to help make that their switch, that their transition and supporting through funding and through resources. So I think of other examples that I believe are doing this work is Black Male Educators STL, BME STL. Is an organization here in St. Louis that is intentional about trying to support Black educators in the field of education, and then also seeking to sort of help with even the teacher shortage by trying to streamline the ways in which the application processes go, because so much of the application process can even come down to various prejudice that play into more discriminatory practices there that can keep our education system from being, our teacher force from being less diverse. Instead of it being about the teacher, it ends up being about who is this? Does this look like a person that I could socialize with? Is a person that I could relate with? And so once you have these dynamics that are so unfair, I believe that all of these here are just different layers in which we have to seek to address this here shortage. Starting in the classroom, starting with the teachers that we currently have, how do we retain them? But then also starting with how do we create this here transition, help with that transition from school to education, teaching. Oh, you're muted, Joe.
I am muted. I am now unmuted. I would like to remind our attendees, if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature, and we'd love to have your questions. We'd love to hear your perspectives so that our panelists can respond to the concerns and the questions from our audience. I'd like to ask a question now, though, of Anastasia Allen. You described the voluntary interdistrict choice program. You mentioned it in your comments, and you pointed out that that program is currently being phased out. I grew up going to St. Louis public schools. I was in the magnet schools, and I was a city student, but I had the opportunity to attend school with students from other parts of the city, from all around the county. And so I really found the interdistrict choice program, commonly known as the DSEG or desegregation program for the locals here in St. Louis, to be a really foundational part of my educational experience. And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit about what effects do you foresee in the phasing out of that program? Is this going to be sort of well, first let's just think about it in terms of what effect it's going to have on educational equity in the region. Is educational equity in the region going to take a hard hit as a result of the phasing out of this program, or do you see other avenues for the pursuit of equity that might be able to sort of step in and fill the shoes of what the VIC program had been doing for the past few decades?
Okay, so I will say that it was designed to do good, and it was systemically dismantled so that it would not be able to. So I would say the first couple of classes of students really were able to get a very diverse experience from the program, and there was lots of interest in the program. However, not every student had the same experience, and it was dismantled in a way to be less effective and more palatable to certain people. To answer the second part of that question, educational equity is not a thing in the city of St. Louis or in the region. Almost every space in here is inequitable. And I think that that was highlighted even more so by the pandemic and the fact that over 50% of city residents didn't have access to broadband internet or a device for students to be able to actively participate in online classes, which led to St. Louis City Schools spending over $2 million buying computers and hotspot devices so that students could have the basic amenity of internet to attend school. As long as there are schools where you have full digital classrooms and whiteboards and fully paid for overseas trips and opportunities to have exchange students, and in the same 15 miles, other students who struggle to even have breakfast, educational equity doesn't exist. I do not see a space where there are going to be programs that are created to increase equity in the region. I see in my opinion, there are going to be ways that people are sheltered from seeing the realities that are going to be of the divides that are going to be created by it, and to kind of dismiss the ramifications of it as other people's fault or as community failures. I think that there are a lot of organizations that are trying to do good and to make these things up, but the problem is systemic. And until we address the system level issues that have created this inequity, which go to property taxes and the way that schools are funded, then it's going to be really, really difficult to create an equitable playing field for students in the region with or without the DSEG program.
Yeah, and I think that really goes to Ebony's point toward the end of her comments about this tension between, on the one hand, we have something that we call public education, but then on the other hand, the mentality that so many parents bring to it is that what they really want it to be is at its core a private good, right? And yeah. So Ebony, you raised this question toward the end of your comments about what kind of future we'd like to have. And so I'm wondering if you'd like to take this opportunity now to expand on that very big question that you concluded your comments with, in terms of where you see, or what's your impression of the St. Louis region in terms of what sort of is there any sort of a shared understanding of what kind of future we want to have as a region, or do you see the St. Louis region as still being fundamentally divided on that question of what kind of future we, whether it's as a nation or as a region or as a city, want to have?
Also, I'm sorry, I don't want to interrupt.
No, go right ahead.
No, there was a question in the chat for Ebony also.
Oh, thank you. Oh, let's see, fancy. Okay, these are related, I think. Thank you for the question, and thank you, Anastasia, for heads up. Do I think we are too divided? Yes. I do not think that, and this is kind of answering the question in the chat, I don't think that there's a way to convince detractors that these efforts are worthwhile. And I say that because in many respects, racism is seen, or I think fundamentally one of the issues is that racism is seen as an individual aberrant act. People are not seeing racism as systemic, normal, foundational to the organization of this country and its development. And so those are literally, those are world apart in our interpretation, okay? And it's not enough for me as your neighbor to say, yes, I know that we both moved through this institution and we both experienced education in this district, but my experience in the same organization was very different from yours. But that's insufficient in convincing folks. I don't think moral arguments will make much of an effort here, because something as simple as, well, we want to include children that are in your district. So we take off the argument around the kind of cosmopolitan ends that we might want to achieve through education. There's not even an interest in serving students beyond the own in your household. And so I'm not confident. In fact, I actually think we'll see, or I think what's been most troubling to me is just the comfort, the attitude, or the kind of the position of, well, if you don't like it, go somewhere else. And I think that's what we will see. That's what we've always seen as kind of a problematic response. So as long as we can say that what we're calling racism, what we're calling critical race theory, that these are interpretations, or as long as people can say that, as long as people believe that, and they can attribute racial differences to cultural explanations or deficit perspectives of Black folks in particular, I don't think we'll make much ground there. How do I say this? I don't think that's my audience. I don't think that I've been put on this earth to try to convince people that racism is real. I've been put on this earth to speak to those who recognize the impact of the continued legacy that we've all inherited, and actually are serious about doing something about it.
So the question in the chat had to do with the detractors or critics of critical race theory, those who are opposed to it or might just be wary of it. And the questioner pointed out that there's so much deliberately misleading, and this is one of the things that, Ebony, you mentioned in your comments, so much deliberately misleading information about critical race theory floating around in the public discourse now. And so the question was about whether it's possible for accurate information or rational argument or persuasion to actually make an impact on those folks who are detractors or who are critics or opponents of critical race theory, when so much of the opposition to it is founded on these misconceptions. So I'm wondering whether Curtis or Anastasia, whether either of you would like to chime in on that question as well.
I will say this, not a single soul in America thinks that we should not have public health insurance. Yet about 50% of the country was thoroughly against Obamacare. And I think that one of the strongest marketing factors or one of the strongest factors that contributes to racism is remarketing and rebranding. And that has been centuries age old things. We don't discriminate on race anymore in the housing market. We discriminate on credit. We don't discriminate on race anymore when it comes to higher education. We just rely on test scores. And so I do not believe, to Ebony's comments, that there is a way to persuade detractors, because there isn't a single person who disagrees that this is actually the true history of America. It's just that we don't want you to teach this in a way that makes our kids feel bad about themselves. And we don't want our kids to be exposed to these radical ideas, even though we might actually agree with them and teach them at home, but we want them to learn it from people that look like us and that share our same values, which is something that communities and people have exercised for a long time. There's another question in the chat about our thoughts on, is there ever a time where it's too young to teach race? I was called a nigger for the first time when I was 5 years old. I was called a nigger bitch for the first time in college. I actively experienced extreme racism in college, where a white girl had a nervous breakdown in our dorm room and was throwing things at us and calling us names and everything under the sun. And then she called her parents and cried, and she was moved out of the dorm less than 24 hours later. But when the 6 Black girls in the dorm expressed concerns about our safety with her being in our suite, we were told that there was nothing that they could do because university housing was full. And so Megan is completely correct that people of color experience this on a daily basis, but white people are questioning whether or not it's okay for their kids to feel bad. And I think that if we erase feeling from it and start thinking about how we can teach them, how we can help them to process those feelings earlier, that's a way better question. You can eliminate a lot of things by introducing concepts early. But I do, to the first person's question, think that it's too late for some people, because we have created our own realities with the help of social media, where there isn't a shared reality amongst people in our country anymore. Like, there were literally hundreds of people who went to Dallas because JFK was coming back because somebody on the internet said that. Where does that make sense at? How do you come to a conclusion or a middle ground with those people? Because I'm not stepping into crazy. And so I don't know where I can potentially pull somebody to the center from who has that sense of belief. The only thing that I can do is educate the people closer to the middle, and hopefully they can reach the fringe. But as a person of color, it is not my job to help people understand how they are oppressing me. Like, if I'm telling you that and you can't validate my experience, I don't know what to do for you, because I'm not going to further oppress myself by trying to make you see my reality, because we're in 2 completely different places.
And Curtis, I'm wondering whether you, as someone who's currently an active teacher in the K12 system, the question that came up in the chat was about the question of how young is too young to teach kids about race. And the questioner points out that this is a question that's really only applicable to white students, because, as Anastasia's comments make clear, this is a question that, or questions about race, learning about race, is something that people of color in the United States have to start doing very early on. And I think this goes to your point about the need to learn about race being a matter of survival for many people of color in the United States. So in terms of thinking about how young is too young to think about race, or whether that's the wrong question to ask, maybe the better question to ask is not how young is too young to start talking about race with students, but maybe the better question to ask is, what are sort of age-appropriate ways of talking about race with students from different racial backgrounds, starting from a very early age? And so I'm wondering whether you could talk a little bit about the ways in which race comes up in your classrooms and how you address it in a way that's sort of developmentally appropriate and age appropriate for the age group of students that you work with.
Yeah, I appreciate that. One thing that I think about, when it comes to this is, it's important that we, talk about it, because when we think about the way in which the systemic racism even plays out in the classroom spaces, it leads students to kind of walk away as if, hey, I'm the problem, I'm the issue, or it's this continued kind of blame factor that ends up sort of making them end up feeling bad, right? When in actuality, it's not necessarily that there's something wrong with the child, it's something wrong with the system. And so, if we're going to begin thinking about how do we begin to edify and build up, our generation, we have to first acknowledge and help them see and help them understand that they are great, that they are phenomenal, that they are brilliant. And one of the things that by, incorporating, say this element of race in the classroom is that you begin to build on students' cultural capacities and these different referents that actually makes them more invested in their learning process. And then because of this level of investment leads to greater, better outcomes. And so, like for me, one of the ways in which I try to do this in my classroom is just by simply kind of presenting a question to the kids for them to engage with and to experience. So I think about genetics. Genetics is a unit that I have to teach as a life in life sciences. We talk about genetics and heredity and how traits are passed down, but then we have to take it to the another level of thinking about, even though traits are something that we all have no choice in terms of how we inherit or what we look like, or different physical characteristics, they do have an impact on our lives. And so one of the things that I try to have the students do is just a more general conversation of, what is there an American standard of beauty? If so, what is it? Right? All of these standards of beauty are based on physical features. And so by the kids beginning to engage in this here work and begin to look at some sharing what they think might have even shaped this here standard of beauty, we begin to end up having to peel back the layers and then go even deeper of thinking about the ways in which this could look on a racial level, but then also thinking about the impacts that the messaging can have, right? And now it's like, hey, I'm not just thinking about you in terms of the way in which you understand the content, but how are you able to apply that? And that's taking the students to a deeper level than just our traditional education system does. And that's honestly setting them up for the future when this is what employers will want, is that you don't just spew out a bunch of facts and knowledge that you can search up on Google or YouTube, but that you actually are able to apply it in a real way. And so having these conversations, I feel like in my class, say for example, when we're talking about beauty, or for example, by bringing up the fact around when we think about Charles Darwin and how even thinking about this racial hierarchy and how uh, Darwin or Carl Linnaeus, I'm sorry, ends up actually categorizing humans based on these physical features in ways that were really that were certainly racist. But here we talk about classification in our schools, and so let's think about the person who is known to have founded our classification system, and see how that was used as a way to justify racism by now even anchoring it to science. So you know it's important for the kids to be able to identify these things, um, because now it empowers them, it builds them up, and it then sets them up to think, to begin to address more present issues that they are even dealing with. rather than just say simply ignoring it. And that's, yeah, that's what I would say in terms of how I try to approach that in my classroom space.
No, that's great. That's great. We have another question, and this is one that I'll throw out for all three of you. It's a short, very direct question that I'll try to offer a little bit more context for. We have an attendee who asks, what is community responsibility? And you know, I think about the comments with which Anastasia kicked things off about how it's easy to believe that the inequities that we see in education in the St. Louis region and really around the country as well are all an accident, but that it actually wasn't an accident that we see the patterns of segregation, that we see the patterns of inequity that we see today. That there are a lot of folks who might believe that this is just a matter of individual people making individual choices, doing what's best for their own family, and that everybody therefore is sort of absolved of the broader systemic culpability for the inequities that are perpetuated in the K-12 education system. But I'm wondering whether each of you could talk a little bit about where you see or how you strike this balance between individual choice on the one hand and this sort of collective responsibility or community responsibility on the other. In other words, how do you see this sort of interplay between, on the one hand, families that want to do what's best for their own children with the responsibility that as members of the community we might share to actually make education available equitably to all students, regardless of what family they come from or what socioeconomic status they come from or what race they are. And let's start with Anastasia, since I sort of name checked you in the way that I set that question up, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. Yeah, I will start off by saying that a lot of people think that school choice is public school, private school, or charter school. School choice actually has a lot to do with money and where people can afford to purchase houses at. And so when you talk about community and collective responsibility, is who are your kids? Are your kids just the ones that live in your house? Or are they the ones that live in your neighborhood? Or are they the ones that live in your city? And then what is community? Who is a part of your community? Is it just the people that look like you, the people that share similar thoughts, or is it your neighbors? Until we have a shared understanding, it's really hard to answer that question, because for some people, they are doing what is best for their community and for their children. And for others, it is an us versus them thing. And so what I will say to that is, I define community responsibility as adults thinking of the ways that they want their children to be able to interact with society. I would say that this is like a kid responsibility, but they're too young. And so as a parent, as an adult, what do you think makes an informed citizen? How do you want your children or the children that you value in your community to be able to interact within the world? And are you doing everything in your power to make that possible? If you are not, then shut up and remove yourself from the dialogue and the conversation, because you're a part of the problem. We have to be willing to be uncomfortable so that we can create the society that we think that our future children or our whatever, that we think that this next generation deserves. The people before us did that. They thought that their kids deserved to continue to grow up in a way that they grew up in. So they built a system that was fractured enough to still create these enclaves where it was okay to just be white. And where they can keep out the outside influences of everybody else. We have to come together as a people to decide that that's not sustainable anymore. We live in a global society. Right now, we could be interacting with individuals all across the globe thanks to telenetworking and social media. And so do we want our kids to be able to function in this global society, or are we still holding out hope that we're going to go back to this nationalism and this pride that started World War II? Because I don't think that that's going to happen. And we need to think about how we prepare our children for that and start creating systems and possibilities for our kids to be competitive on that level, because every other country is, with math, with science, with cultural responsibility. And America is the only place that's still denying its past in a way that is making us have to say things like Black lives simply do just matter. Not matter more, not matter less, not matter exceptionally in this position, like they just matter. The fact that that is something that is contentious in America is a problem. And so community responsibility is, we need to collectively decide who is in our community and what do we want for the next generation.
What about you, Ebony? What do you make of this question about what community responsibility is and how it sort of, or what the interplay is between individual, between, doing what's right or what's best for one's own family versus whatever responsibilities one might have to a broader community outside of one's household?
I guess kind of when I first read that question, I saw it in a different light. And I initially thought community responsibility in terms of what, I didn't know if it was to advance equity or, well, I wasn't sure, but I was kind of thinking about in response. I think of education as a community building institution. So I think it preserves in communities. I think it creates communities. I think we organize communities around schools. But there are many, but to that end, community is very nebulous in terms of how we define it, as Anastasia has already pointed out. But if we're talking about this particular debate, communities are already involved. I mean, I think that's part of the contention. So I guess for me, if the anonymous questioner wanted to elaborate a bit more, it would be helpful in this regard. But if the question is what's the responsibility of communities to advance equity, then I will have a different answer. So I guess I'll hold off and see if they are still here.
Okay. And what about you, Curtis? When you think about this interplay between individual versus communal responsibility, or the interplay between responsibility to a broader community versus responsibility just to one's own children or one's own family and household. Well, how do you see that tension play out in the U City district, or perhaps in the particular school that you work in? And yeah, so maybe just talk a little bit about how you see maybe parents primarily, but maybe also even students struggling with or wrestling with that question.
Yeah, that's a good one. I even when I think about this idea of community, individual, I want to think even too about it like more broadly, right? Like when we consider who our neighbor is or who isn't, I think it's a large part of it is wrapped up in the big St. Louis question of what high school did you go to? Just by asking this question alone, we begin to, sort of disenfranchise groups. We begin to disassociate or think about what the connections might be, whether or the extent of what our reach with them will, how far or it will go. And just it's sad, I think, that even for St. Louis, that this is a tradition, because it is one that shows how evidently how segregated our cities are. And so one of the things I think is maybe what we one of the things that I see oftentimes around any kind of good team, any kind of good sport, even like within even districts, is there's the mantra, right? They're trying to bring people together around this mantra. So when I was in Kirkwood, it was like one Kirkwood. When I was in here in U City, there's this. I love how the energy they bring around, like this idea around U City, and then folks will be like, and again, I think we got to redefine the mantra for St. Louis if we're going to think about trying to sort of bridge any divide that's happening across the greater St. Louis. And instead of asking maybe, what high school that you went to, I think that, or we have to begin trying to ask different questions that can sort of unify or help bridge that sort of divide. I don't have that right now, but I think that's again one of those things I think that we could begin to try to process to at least bring clarity to my individual responsibility and to the collective whole.
All right, thanks for that. We have another question in the chat, and this one I'll also open up to all three of our panelists. And this is, well, we obviously have an academically oriented audience here tonight. And so one of our attendees asks the question, what can we as young scholars doing research on American culture and American history do in our research to further the goals of equity in our country, or I would say also perhaps just in our region? And I'll start with Anastasia on that question. What can young scholars in the St. Louis region really be doing to further goals of equity through the academic work and the academic research that we're doing?
Yeah, I would say to start really being intentional about rewriting American history. I am always deeply concerned that there are still first Black people or first Asian people to do certain things in 2021. And really starting to go back and understand the history of exclusion, but to find examples of individuals who have done this outstanding and amazing work, and to make them a part of the timeline of American history where we can learn about these people outside of February and October and, Native American Heritage Week and whatnot. Like, I think that it's really hard to feel valued when your history is always othered, especially in a K12 setting. It's not ever taught as a part of American history. Like, Black people didn't start at slavery and we didn't end at the civil rights movement. And I think that it's really important for researchers to start to redefine text through a more inclusive lens and to write about it factually. The fact of the matter is that specific types of people, specific races of people were not allowed to be in these spaces. And then when they were allowed in, the advancements that they were able to make in that short period of time potentially slowed down like so much progress in that space because you were keeping intelligence away from it. And so when we can start being truthful and telling everybody's story in the fabric of American history, I think that we will be better off in creating opportunities to increase equity. And as researchers, I think that's your job to start doing, is to really think critically about how we stop othering everybody else except white people and make sure that we're telling a fully inclusive story of how this country was formed and the contributions that people made to this society in a way that doesn't make it seem like some phenomenal thing, but is a part of the continuum of our growth.
What about you, Curtis? When you think about what young scholars at a university like Washington University might be able to do to further goals of equity, or what what scholars might be able to do to further those goals in the St. Louis region here. As you think about that as somebody who's working in one of our local school districts, I guess maybe what I'm wondering is, what can we as scholars be doing that would be most helpful to someone like you who's on the front lines working with children in the classroom?
Yeah, well, one thing I remember when attending WashU, there was this real sense of this sort of bubble, right? And everybody talk about this WashU bubble. And I think that, a large part is just trying to get outside of that bubble. And the ways in which we practically can do that is through the relationships that we build. And so looking into partner with school districts, a lot of school districts are needing for that, but trying to do that in authentic ways, right? Like not just trying to come in and use this as sort of and people as sort of your for your research interests only, but looking to develop the relationship and see even how you can come and just authentically support, because by being in those spaces again, it can lead to some serendipity, these conversations I feel that could even inspire your perspective to help you then now begin to ask questions that you probably wouldn't have considered just if you had not stepped outside of their bubble. Again, like many school districts are looking for partnerships. They're looking for these supports. Many teachers would love to have extra hands. And even in this time of COVID, there are some ways in which we creatively make that happen. But that would be one practical way that this could be done, because now you get a chance, like again, to expand your work, the types of questions that you ask, because now you've expanded your perspective.
And Ebony, is someone who is involved on a day-to-day basis in the training of teachers, what sort of advice do you give to your students about how they can use their research or their academic pursuits to advance racial equity?
Well, this will be a little bit different. I typically encourage my students to highlight the voices of young people. I think that we write a lot about young people, but we rarely talk to young people about what they're experiencing in schools, about what they think we should do to improve education. So, but that's for folks who are doing more contemporary work. For historians in particular, for folks in American cultural studies, who are taking a more historical perspective, I would encourage you to highlight ways or highlight instances of community agency. Ironically, we were talking about community a little while ago, but thinking about ways in which African Americans in particular have stood in the gap of a federal government that was not attempting or any interested in educating Black youth, state governments, local governments, even while we were being taxed in time. So all this to say, highlighting those instances where communities were at work, standing in the gap, and creating incredible school communities, I think is one kind of way to do that. Offline, though, we can talk about whether or not, or what we even mean by education equity. I think that's a different panel on a different day. But I will say, again, highlighting agency. I think we have, and I'm part of this problem. We focus a lot on structure. So how society is organized. We haven't focused as much on how individuals respond and challenge and resist some of those patterns. So I think that would be the number one recommendation for young researchers in AMCS and history.
Thank you. So we're getting close to our wrap up point. We'll wrap things up by 5:30 here. But before we do, I'd like to give each of our panelists an opportunity to offer some closing thoughts or some closing reflections on tonight's discussion. We'll start, well, I guess we'll just go in reverse order from what we started with. And so that means, Ebony, I'm going to put you on the spot yet again, even though I went to you third on the last one. So if you have any thoughts that you think might, or reflections that you think really sum up for you the main takeaway point that you'd like people to come away from this conversation with, what would you say that would be?
Yeah, sure. So again, the main takeaway point for me is what this debate boils down to is really what type of future we're preparing our students for. I think of education as both perspective, so looking forward, but I also kind of on my more spiritual days, I think that it can be something that is expressing a faith, expressing what we hope our society will become. And so what I'm seeing now is in terms of this tension is that we just really are divided around what we want in the future, what we want for our children. And so when you bring that question into it, what do you want for your children? It's easy to see why folks are so upset and why this is so contentious. But that would be the question that I leave us with. What society do we want to see? Because what we do today in schools is directly expressing what we believe we're preparing our students for, our young people for tomorrow. So thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you. What about you, Curtis? What sort of takeaway point would you like for our attendees to come away from this conversation with?
Yeah, as an educator, I think about, how are we going to be preparing our youth for the future? And one of the things that I think is we have to begin changing sort of the questions and the things that we're doing in the classroom spaces from just the traditional structures of focusing solely on skill set and knowledge. Skills is mostly what we see our standardized testing to be about. And then knowledge is just us trying to continue to assess that work. But I believe we have to begin also trying to identify and focus on identity and criticality because we know so much more. And with all this knowledge that we now know, it should now inform how we move forward. The work and understanding that we have around social emotional learning wasn't something we knew back in some years ago, but now that we do better. And the same goes with criticality. One, I think that this has been something that's been around for some time and it's becoming more to everyone's knowledge and peer view. And so I think that what we have to begin doing is, now that we know this, we have to begin using it and doing better. And so that's why I would say it's not just focusing on the skills and the knowledge, but also focusing on the identity and the criticality.
Thank you. And finally, let's go to Anastasia Allen. Anastasia, what sort of take home would you like to see attendees come away from this conversation with?
Yeah, so two things. One, I'm a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, and one of our mottos is by merit and by culture. And I say that because as you guys are researching and learning more about American history, make sure that you are looking for examples of merit and examples of where people are standing out in the culture to be able to highlight, to weave together the fabric of American education and of American society. The second part is my favorite James Baldwin quote is that the paradox of education is that the more that a person becomes educated, the more that they begin to question the society in which they are being educated. And if we are raising kids who are not allowed to question the system, who are not challenging history, who are not actively trying to change something about what is happening around them, are we truly educating people? And I think that that's probably one of my biggest issues with critical race theory. Are you not okay with your society being critically examined? Because if that's not the case, then you don't want your children to be educated. You want them to be taught how to work in an assembly line. And we have to be willing to be critical of ourselves and of our systems if we ever expect to advance as a society. And I hope that people who, because this is like preaching to the choir, everybody here has some sort of interest or semblance of understanding this better, but the people who don't attend, I would really question them on that. Do you want your children to be able to be educated, or do you want them to be able to be drones? Because if they are not allowed to question, then they are not allowed to grow.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists, Anastasia Allen, Ebony Duncan Shippey, Curtis O'Dwyer. Your insights this evening were great, and the conversation was wonderful, and I hope that all of our attendees found it enlightening. This was our last Americanist Dinner Forum for the fall semester. It's been a great semester with a lot of wonderful conversations. I encourage all of our attendees to keep an eye on your inboxes, and we will be making announcements about our slate of spring offerings for the Americanist Dinner Forum soon. So like I say, please keep an eye on your inbox. Thank you all for coming, and I hope that you all have a wonderful evening. And good night.
Thank you. Good night.